Hey guys, how's it going? Roger says hey as always. Scarlett says hey. She's looking for squirrels out the window. So today we have got another Patreon request. The video today is requested by one of my patrons, Stephen Parker. He says this video shows a major step towards Parliament becoming the decision maker rather than the monarchy, but it led to the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland and 2 rebellions in Scotland. It was divisive in other ways as well, and at the end has something familiar to most Americans. Now, I have done a video on the opening of Parliament and Prime Minister's questions, which we're going to do a little bit more on coming up pretty soon here. And over the course of those videos, I've had a lot of people from the UK try to teach me a little bit more about how Parliament works and how the UK government works. And you guys have told me quite often that you guys have a constitutional monarchy over there. And I think it's a mistake that a lot of Americans think of the monarchy as an absolute monarchy, because that is the sort of monarchy that, we always have in mind when we think about monarchies. But you guys have, left a lot of comments on my videos letting me know that a constitutional monarchy doesn't really concentrate a lot of the power in the monarchy. It's more concentrated in Parliament, and the monarchy has kind of limited powers. You've also let me know it's a common misconception that the UK does not have a constitution, and I also know that you guys have a Bill of Rights that apparently we based our Bill of Rights on. So that might be what Stephen is referring to in his comment about something being familiar to us. Now, when it comes to the term the Glorious Revolution, I can't tell you exactly what it's about other than what Stephen has laid out here. It is a term that is familiar to me, and I think we do learn about it. We do learn about UK history over here in the US. For me, though, it's just been a long time since I've learned about it, and frankly don't remember anything about it. I've also been learning a lot about UK history over on Patreon, where I'm watching Horrible Histories, which is basically a kids history TV show. It uses a lot of comedy to teach history. I'm really enjoying it over there, and they kind of hammer home a lot of UK history in each episode. So I have been learning a little bit about the history of Britain, and it'll be cool to see if any of this kind of ties into some of that stuff. Without further ado, let's learn a bit about UK history and the government.
There's so much weirdness in this one image that I want to point it out to you bit by bit. So this is obviously a coronation ceremony. Specifically, it's the coronation of William and Mary in England 1689. And that's the first peculiarity. They're being coronated as co-regents, co-monarchs.
We have a College of William and Mary over here. I believe it's in Virginia. So I guess it's named after, I didn't know who it was named after, but okay, William and Mary here. Let's find out. I don't know who they are though. I guess a king and queen.
And that's the first peculiarity. They're being coronated as co-regents, co-monarchs, sharing power between two in a role which we typically have in our head as a job for one. So, a split crown and authority. Second oddity, one of those co-regents, William, on the verge of being King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, is neither English, Scottish, nor Irish, but rather Dutch. But most history books will describe no great war between England and the Netherlands in this period. So how did a Dutchman rise to share the throne? And last, the peculiarity I think most significant, the document being held in front of them. It's not what we might expect at a coronation, a congratulatory letter, a religious text, or a royal poem. No, it's a list of demands from the Parliament. It starts with complaints against the predecessor king, James II, and then lists a series of desired limitations on the new monarch's powers. Granted, it wasn't technically required William and Mary accept these limitations in order to ascend to the throne. Nonetheless, an odd way to greet your new king and queen, crashing their coronation to tell them what they shouldn't do. It's a lot to digest, but understanding this mystery will allow us to focus on the foundation of power in the United Kingdom's political system. I'll address the Dutchman first. William of Orange invaded England in 1688. A prince from the Netherlands crossing the Channel with a fleet of ships, landing in Brixham, and successfully marching his force to Westminster to be crowned king is a deceptively simple explanation of what happened. That's because William of Orange was invited to invade. Though by nationality he was absolutely foreign, he had a couple things going for him. Perhaps most important, he was a Protestant at a time when England's king, James II, was Catholic. Now, James II enjoyed support from Catholics within Ireland and Scotland, but sentiment in England was resoundingly anti-Catholic after years of religious violence between the two. They resented pushes by James II to normalize Catholicism in the kingdom. They claimed he suspended laws of parliament in order to do so. They feared his drives to maintain a standing army as the actions of a tyrant. And as a catalyst to their angst, James II's wife gave birth to a son in 1688. As critics saw it, a son who would continue the tyrannical Catholic dynasty over Protestant England. Which brings us to the second thing William of Orange had going for him as an invader of the British Isles. He was also a part of King James' family. He was James's son-in-law, the husband of Mary, a product of James' first marriage. So why would being in the hated king's family actually help? Well, the newborn and direct Catholic heir to the throne was a product of James' second marriage. By invading, removing James and his second family, and installing himself, William of Orange broke the Catholic part out of the equation while still maintaining royal lineage through James' Protestant daughter and through himself, her Protestant husband. In a letter addressed to William of Orange by 7 powerful noblemen, each carrying an important sounding title like Earl, Lord, Bishop, the point of view of English Protestants, particularly Protestant elites, came into view. This was 1688, and they wrote, "The people are so generally dissatisfied with the present conduct of the government in relation to their religion, liberties, and properties, all of which have been greatly invaded. It is no less certain that much the greatest part of the nobility and gentry are as much dissatisfied, and there is no doubt but that some of the most considerable of them would venture themselves with your highness at your first landing. Please, Dutch prince, come depose our king, and bring his daughter with you." You'll note
this was really interesting. William of Orange is a name that we learn about over here in the U.S. We actually learn about this stuff. I just don't remember the history lesson. William of Orange is a very, very familiar name. I learned about him in multiple history classes in school. It just didn't permanently make it into my head who he was, and this is vaguely familiar of him coming to England and becoming a king to me. He's vaguely familiar. Okay, good to kind of get it more cemented in my head who he was and what he did. It's also really interesting to me how much the Catholic versus Protestant aspect is playing into this. Now, I don't know if he's just kind of focusing on that or if it really was that important, Catholics versus Protestants. I think it was more of a bigger deal over in Europe than it was over here in the U.S. We've never really had any major issues with Catholics versus Protestants over here, and that might be because the Protestants really were the ones that kind of came over here with pilgrims and all of that stuff, and we were pretty firmly established as more of a Protestant country. But even with Catholics coming over here too, we just didn't have, that I'm aware of, any major issue between the two aspects of Christianity. But it's interesting to hear about that over here in England.
You'll notice also 2 diverging lines of reasoning here. We already mentioned religion. James wanted Catholicism legally accepted in English society, while his Protestant opposition averse to what they called the Popish religion. The second line of reasoning seems to contradict the first. They get on a ramble in the letter about Parliament and end with this: "If things cannot then be carried to the king's wishes in a parliamentary way, other measures will be put in execution by more violent means." Basically, the Catholic king will continue to ask things of Parliament that Parliament doesn't want to give, and upon denial, he will usurp them with violence. Thus, the king is a tyrant, as they wrote, religion, liberties, properties greatly invaded. I only mention the second line of reasoning to you because, though mixed in with the religious stuff, their complaints about the king threatening the legislative body proves important to our exploration. So William saw the letter and agreed. And what was astounding about his 1688 invasion was the lack of violence. Resistance would come from the Scottish and Irish in the following years, but during the initial march, William and his 25,000 men quickly gained support on their way to London. As Professor Stephen Pincus describes in his brief history of the Glorious Revolution, Common people, gentry, and nobility, disgusted with James II's government but fearing his power, soon found the courage to pour into William's camp and rise independently throughout England, offering both physical and financial support.
The other question I have about this was when was Parliament actually established? Because I don't know. I thought that Parliament was a fairly more recent establishment in England, but we're going back to the 1600s and it's already established. And so I'm wondering when exactly it came to be and how that came to be, because we've started this video where Parliament already exists. So if you guys will let me know down in the comments when Parliament kind of was established as a legislative body, and maybe how that happened. And it's also really interesting to me to have this thing of a legislative, like a more democratic legislative body, and then a monarch as well, and they're having to kind of compete with each other, work together. Like to Americans, that's really strange. Like we don't understand that, because we just don't have that over here. It's a very, very different system. So it's really interesting to see this kind of play out. So I'm kind of interested in seeing how this was kind of reconciled. Also, James, isn't James II the one that got his head chopped off, or is that Charles? I think it was James II. Horrible Histories actually did a sketch on that, and I can't remember which monarch it was, but maybe it was this one, James II.
William of Orange landed in England, marched towards London, was greeted by cheering crowds and defecting soldiers of King James, who then fled to France. At their own behest, William and Mary acceded together as King William III and Queen Mary II. Hence the picture with which we started. And now we can finally who then fled to France towards London, was greeted by cheering crowds and defecting soldiers of King James, who then fled to France. At their own behest, William and Mary acceded together as King William III and Queen Mary II. Hence the picture with which we started. And now we can finally address that document, that list of demands being read to them at their 1689 coronation. It starts with complaints against James II on religious grounds, subverting Protestantism, affiliating with the Catholic Church, disarming Protestants while arming Catholics. This has been interpreted as the more conservative part of the 1689 revolution. Then came, for our purposes, the more interesting bits. They complained of the king dispensing and suspending laws without Parliament's consent, using tax for purposes other than what was intended by Parliament, maintaining a standing army without Parliament's consent, and by blocking free and fair elections of Parliament. As John Locke might put it, the social contract was broken. Absolutism was under attack, not an uncommon theme in 17th century English history, but this time it would be codified. Late 1689, the Parliament creates a statute form of their listed complaints and restrictions. They author and pass the Bill of Rights. Included were the aforementioned exclusive powers of Parliament to create and terminate law, levy tax, and maintain an army, but also a vague but precedent-setting provision for free elections of the Parliament and free speech within it. If the Magna Carta in 1215 was an attempt to subject the king to his own laws, a foundation of limited government, this was now an act, almost 500 years later, that future lawmaking must go through an elected parliament. The sovereignty, the crown of the monarch, was moving from the palace to the parliament, and would gather there through our time. Hence where we get...
So the Magna Carta is also something we learn about over here in American history, and I believe we are taught that it's kind of like the foundation. It was kind of one of the first more like democratic documents, and we do learn that it's kind of like one of the foundations for our own constitution over here, or it inspired our founding fathers to create a constitution. It's interesting hearing what the Bill of Rights contains, though. It's different than our Bill of Rights over here. Our Bill of Rights is more focused on just the people of the United States and their rights. It looks like the Bill of Rights here is establishing more of Parliament's rights. So there's a little difference there with that.
We get the controversial term parliamentary sovereignty, a concept which evolved after the revolution in 1689 and is best described by constitutional theorist A.V. Dicey in his introduction to the study of the law of the Constitution. He writes, "Parliament thus defined has, under the English Constitution, the right to make or unmake any law whatever, and, further, that no person or body is recognized by the law of England as having a right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament. In layman's terms, which I've seen laid out in a couple different places, Parliament may legislate on any subject, no Parliament can bind its successors or be bound by its predecessors, and no person or entity can challenge the validity of an act of Parliament, be they court or king. In this model, the checks and balances so inherent to the American Constitution simply don't exist in a way that we would recognize them. You and I could draw the American system like this, with the Congress creating law, executive enforcing law, and judiciary interpreting law, each impacting the others, but acting independently. If we would attempt to do the same for the United Kingdom, we would encounter great overlap, as everyone from the Prime Minister to the civil service all serve at the pleasure of the majority in Parliament.
See, this is interesting too, because he just said that even courts can't challenge the law of Parliament. Now, I might be misinterpreting this, but that's not really the same way it works over here. If Congress passes a law or whatever, you can basically bring court. You can take it to court and challenge the validity of it. And that's kind of where a lot of those cases end up in the Supreme Court. They start in the lower courts first, and then sometimes they make their way up to the Supreme Court. So there is a way to challenge the legislation that comes out of Congress here in the United States. And also the executive branch can veto it as well. So there are ways to counter legislation. It sounds like that's not the case with Parliament though, but again, this is a very simplified explanation. I might not be understanding that correctly.
Prime Minister to the civil service all serve at the pleasure of the majority in Parliament. The Glorious Revolution in 1689 led to an institution with, if not complete sovereignty, expansive power in the United Kingdom, the legal right to legislate on any topic without question. But parliamentary sovereignty doesn't come without criticism. Struggling a bit with the concept myself, I went and grabbed a couple books from the library. This one, The Essentials of UK Politics by Andrew Haywood, contains a digestible objection. He writes that the Parliament is not and has never been politically sovereign. Parliament has the legal right to make, amend, or unmake any law it wishes, but not always the political ability to do so. A simple explanation would be that Parliament could, in theory, abolish elections, but this would likely result in widespread public protests, if not popular rebellion. Even if we accept all this criticism as true, distinguishing between the legal right of Parliament to try to legislate on anything and the political ability to do so, there's still no proper checks and balances. The United States Supreme Court is an institution we know to be a check on the President and Congress.
See, this is the thing that Americans don't understand, is that we have pretty much everything laid out in writing of what you can and can't do. And in the UK, you guys don't have that. But I've had a lot of people in the comments be like, well, if they tried to overstep their bounds, the people would rise up against it and so forth. For Americans, that's not good enough. For us, it's we can't just bank on that happening. We have to have it laid out, absolutely written down of what can and can't happen. So I think we're a little bit more stringent on that than the UK. And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here. So it's just interesting. I'm not saying, and I'm not attacking the UK and how you guys do things. It's just a different way of doing it. I'm just trying to explain the differences in the thought process between the American system and the UK system. I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just interesting to see the differences is all.
The United Kingdom Supreme Court, by contrast, was created by Parliament in 2005 and defaults to parliamentary sovereignty when making rulings. In short, the UK Constitution is malleable, and that's what makes it interesting. The result of England's revolution in 1689 was a document meant to create a wall of separation between the monarch and the legislature. And to a US observer, it does seem like a radical concentration of power, one the writers of the American Constitution sought to avoid by creating 3 co-equal branches of government. But while the American founders sought to distinguish their new system from the one developing in Westminster, they did embrace some of the messaging. And I think you'll find that the echo of the protests in the English Declaration of Rights reverberates in a familiar way upon second reading. Unqualified persons have been returned and served on juries. Excessive bail and illegal and cruel punishments inflicted for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefit of trial by jury. by raising and
keeping a standing army within this kingdom in time of peace without consent of Parliament.
He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures,
and quartering soldiers contrary to law,
quartering large bodies of armed troops among us,
by violating the freedom of elections of members to serve in Parliament,
for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever,
dispensing and suspending laws without Parliament's consent.
He has refused his assent to laws necessary for the public good,
by levying money for another manner than the same was granted by Parliament,
for imposing taxes on us without our consent.
King James II having abdicated the government.
He has abdicated the government here. Resistance to absolutism, limited government, social contracts, taxation only with representation. Ironically, the American Declaration of Independence, the document meant to forever sever the United States from the Kingdom of Great Britain, actually reveals to us our common heritage.
Yeah, so I guess that last point just kind of lays out kind of what I was saying in the beginning about how our founders over here were inspired quite a bit by a lot of the English documents that had come before it. Although it looks like the English documents were talking about James II, and of course the Americans were talking more about King George, I believe. I don't remember if it was the second or third. I think it was the third King George, which I also learned from Horrible Histories. I learned that there were, well, they presented 4 King Georges, but I think somebody said that there was like 6 or something actually. But anyway, I think it was the third King George, who was kind of like considered the crazy one, that was on the throne when the U.S. was trying to separate itself from Britain. So talking about 2 different two different kings in the monarchy there, but a lot of the language was very similar. And I do know that they took a lot of the language from that. They took a lot of language from some philosophers, like John Locke, for instance, was I think an English political philosopher, and he had a huge impact on the U.S. Creation of its government and its ideologies and so forth. So we do take quite a bit from our English heritage, our British heritage over here. At the same time, it is interesting to also see the differences and see where the founders diverged from that and decided to do something a little different. Now, of course, we didn't have a monarchy over here to contend with, which is where a lot of those differences come into play, I think. So Britain's Constitution, Bill of Rights, written mainly around the concept of their monarchy that they decided to continue with over there. Ours is built more around the co-equal branches of government and then the rights of the citizens. So it's a little different, but it also has a lot of commonalities with the UK as well. So very, very interesting. It also raised a lot of questions. Like, I want to learn more about the British Constitution, which he didn't really get into. He talked about like the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Rights, but I don't know where the Constitution came in necessarily. I don't really know about the history of Parliament and how that came to be. So those are 2 things that I would like to learn a little bit more about here. Again, I hope you guys don't take any of my comments wrongly here. If you're from the UK, I mean nothing but respect. I'm just trying to learn more about how you guys do things over there. I am pointing out some differences between the US and the UK because I think it's just a really fascinating topic to see. Our origins are from England in the UK, and yet we diverged and kind of did a slightly different thing here, but we still have a lot in common. You know, I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. So don't take any of my comments as a criticism at all. Hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did, and we'll of course be doing a lot more history on the UK, a lot of topics on the UK as well. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching. Also, thanks Stephen for the video suggestion, and we'll see you guys next time.